So, parish orphans and retrogrades, the study document for the new, I guess, third millennium Catholic interpretation of papal primacy dropped today. And it's 150 pages or so, 145. And I haven't read the whole thing. I'm going to go through the section on Vatican I with you. But for now, suffice it to say this, what Cardinal Koch said in an interview. When asked by Vatican News, is it possible to envision for the future a shared form of exercise of the Petrine primacy over all Christendom that is separate from the Church's jurisdiction over the Latin Church? He responded, indeed, some ecumenical dialogues suggest a clearer distinction between the different responsibilities of the Bishop of Rome, in particular what might be called the Pope's patriarchal ministry within the Western or Latin Church, and in his primatial service of unity in the communion of all the churches, both Western and Eastern. Parish orphans and retrogrades. I will read the most important part, as far as I can ascertain it thus far, of the study document to you. I've read part of the most important part. I'll be reading further in that most important part than I've been yet live. So I would initially lay this thought on you. It's a preliminary thought, and I'm still working through it. I'll always tell you, look, I'm confident about X. I'm not sure at all about Y, or I'm pretty confident about Z. Jay Dyer has long talked about, for at least a year and a half, a plan that has semi-secretly been harbored close between the Eastern Orthodox leaders and Roman Catholic leaders for a reunification in 2025, and even a document which attests to this. Today's Vatican study document seems to lend force to the notion that there is a planned reunification in view, maybe even immediate view, if Dyer's right, and that religious doctrinal purity, whether from the RC side or the EO side, is not the primary impetus for the drafting of the document or of the conceiving of the reunification. It is some crass global geopolitical goal. I'm not sure, but I do know this, that when Cardinal Koch talks about ecumenical dialogues suggesting a clearer distinction between the different responsibilities of the Bishop of Rome, the Latin Church ones, and his primatial service of unity in the communion of all the churches, both Western and Eastern, there is an insinuation of a kind of universal primate of the Pope, a conception of a Pope as first among equals, a Bishop of Rome, let's say, as a first among equals that is highly amenable to Eastern Orthodox. Now, that doesn't, hear me out, that doesn't make it ipso facto evil. The first Christian millennium was mainly governed by the idea of the Tetrarchy, the 5 C's: Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, with their archbishop slash primate slash patriarch, their head guy, their head cleric, being ranked ordinally so that the See of Rome outranked the See of Constantinople, which outranked the See of Jerusalem, which outranked the See of Antioch, which outranked the See of Alexandria. I might have switched 4 and 5. but that they all sat together at a round table, like, Knights of the Round Table. So first bishop, first primate, first archbishop was Rome. And the Eastern Orthodox have always acknowledged that. You have to understand, American Orthodox sound at times as if they reject the Bishop of Rome altogether, that he has any kind of primatial primacy. They don't. If you listen to what the Orthodox have actually claimed from the beginning, it's just that they cling to a first millennium model of the Bishop of Rome. He's the first among equals. He's considered most important primatially, more than the Patriarch of Constantinople, in many ways their head guy, the EO head guy, but that he can't necessarily boss them around, that he doesn't necessarily hold a universal jurisdiction. We're going to talk about Vatican I, the way that this study document conceives of Vatican I. It's not all Francis mischief. I mean, for one thing, this all begins with Ut Unum Sint, a 1995 JP2 document. JP2 being, I don't see JP2 as an inherently trustworthy figure, the way a lot of you J2P2s out there do. But everyone trusts any pope more than Francis. And ecumenism, reunification, was a greater pet project dearer to the heart of JP2 than it is to Francis. So in whatever sense this is capitulatory or liberal or hyperlenient to non-Catholics, to the non-Catholic side, it is more 29-year anniversary document with regard to Ut Unum Sint, the 1995 reunification document circulated by JP2 that did, like Francis, you might like John Paul II. You might love him. You might have a close connection to him, a devotion to him. But he's got more in common with Francis than you think. And I'm not saying that all of this is nonsensical or evil or apostasy the way some rad-trads are saying. By rad-trads, I don't mean trads like myself or Taylor Marshall or anyone like that. I just mean rad-trads are quick to see everything as apostasy. And that one statement by Cardinal Koch alone sounds like it. I don't think it is. But I would say this is a 29-year anniversary thing. Why not wait, 7 months and circulate it as a 30-year anniversary of Ut Unum Sint, which was a 1995 document, which did make use of synodality, study commissions, kind of primatial primacy that reinvigorated, rehabilitates the Eastern Orthodox conception of what the Bishop of Rome does. Interesting. The way that this will be received, I'm going to get to particulars in a little bit, but I would say as a final preliminary thought that the way this is going to shake out with the variant lobby groups, if you will, in the Catholic Church is the following. The rad-trads will always be very hasty to point to anything new as apostatizing because that strengthens their case. Whether you're talking, I guess now we even have to talk about old Catholics, right? Old Catholics are pre-Vatican I Catholics. They're a little, they figure in this a little bit interestingly, but they're a small group. We don't hear from them so often. Sedes are obviously pre-1958 Catholics. The last real pope was Pius XII. They're going to be self-interestedly hasty in characterizing this new document as, a prima facie exercise of apostasy. And they'll point to Cardinal Koch as just rubber stamping that apostasy, that the first statement I read to you. I don't think that's true. But where I am curious is where moderate trads like myself will come out. Well, other moderate trads like myself will come out on this. I'm not usually too interested in what anyone else's opinion is, save for a very, very few voices. And Anthony Stein is one of the few I look to. I find him very, very close to where I come out, so I look to him as confirmatory. Classical theist, I'll look at. There aren't many others. Yeah, on this issue, I might. I'm not uninterested in what Taylor will wind up saying, because these are moderate trad. There's a spectrum of moderate tradness among these three guys alone. But particularly Anthony Stein, also the other two, you might want to have a look at what they say. Yeah, Anthony's a smart guy, and he's, above all, of the whole Catholic commentariat, he's not trying to serve an interest lobby. He just wants to get it right. And he'll say, like me, I don't really care who it pisses off or who it doesn't. I just want to get it right. And I haven't read this whole document yet. So check out what Anthony says. Classical theist will be interesting. Taylor will be interesting. I don't really care what anyone else says. But the funny thing is, among the young Pope-splainers who are like far right on other issues but are Pope-splainery, I don't think they'll like the document. Why? Because it is Francis reducing papal maximalism. It is a facially papal primacy de minimis document. And so I think this might be the first time you ever hear some Pope-splainers moving to criticize, maybe not outright criticize Francis, because that would be too obvious a breach of their own credo, but you're going to see them being very uncomfortable with the return, as it were, to a first Christian millennium posture on the papacy. So hard trads will say it's apostasy. Pope-splaining, like 20-year-olds that are new to the church and don't really understand the Francis pontificate, much less the true dichotomy between papal power in the first Christian millennium and the second Christian millennium, or maybe they have some cursory understanding of that. They won't like it either. They won't say it's apostasy. I expect Anthony Stein to probably say things like me. I mean, I don't mince words. When it's a clear case of, okay, this is wrong, this is bad, we can't have female deacons, and they're definitely going to do it, you'll hear me say it. I, however, have long, and this is more a JP2 thing than a Francis thing, I have long said we must, as a matter of being intellectually honest, see that there is a grossly, vastly different conception of papal authority. I don't even know if you can call it papal primacy in the first Christian millennium than there was in the second Christian millennium. And the proof of this is that the Eastern Orthodox did not go into schism until the beginning of the second Christian millennium. And I mean, you can prove it a million other ways, but that's the most ready at hand means of demonstrating the point. And if there can be an organic growth, or whatever have you, between papal primacy in the first Christian millennium and the second, then conceivably in the beginning of the third, if you get change embracing popes like JP2, very change embracing, much more liberal than I think a lot of you think, or Francis, or even Benedict. Benedict even repeated, I mean, he's the one that, as Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, signed Ut Unum Sint. He's the one that signed the justification document with the Lutherans around the same time, a year or two after Ut Unum Sint in the late 90s. Then that was an if-then statement, ... Then we have to take seriously that even though Pastor Aeternus, the Vatican I document, which I have luckily reread recently, is, while dogmatic, it is in some way mutable. How can it be perfectly dogmatic in a crystallized form if it represented new dogmatic teaching on papal primacy itself that was not operative in the first Christian millennium, when the Tetrarchy was really the way? Now, people will say Tetrarchy was, the 5 C's was mainly the first 500 or 600 years, but it was operative until we didn't even have a college of cardinals until a little before the first Christian millennium ended. So these are all preliminary thoughts, and I'm just peppering you with, I don't think this is straight up Francis foolishness. JP2's fingerprints are all over it also, and I don't trust him a ton more than Francis, but there's a philosophical natural law, natural reason article of undeniability, a little pebble beneath all these mattresses that is undeniable. Authority has never been worked out in the Roman Catholic Church to the extent that we insinuate it has when we thumb our noses at Protestants and say, you guys have no conception of authority. They don't. But we flatly don't even know how many times, with certitude, how many times Pastor Aeternus, ex cathedra announcements to the whole world, dogmatization, ex nihilo, by the Pope, have been exercised. Some say it's only 2. Some say it's 5 or 6. Some say it's like 7 or 8. That means we too, at a much finer grain, have an issue with authority. If pastor, I've said this to you for a long time, this is not just, Vatican III will not only address Vatican II. How many times have you said that? How many times have you heard me do the little formula? Vatican I plus Vatican II equals the need for Vatican III. I'm going to read from the document for you directly, but we not only have had a changing conception of what papal primacy requires from first Christian millennium to second Christian millennium, proving it can't be like strictly de fide in an unchanging way. But also we have that meta-magisterial issue where we also point at the Protestants, we say you have no authority and you also have no magisterial authority, meaning, anyone can read the Bible and say it means anything he wants. Yeah, but we also don't have a meta-magisterial statement on that kind of authority either, because we don't know, outside of Denzinger, Ott, Newman, anything other than theories as to what levels of authority there are. Well, there's ex cathedra, but there's also religious submission. People are just abstracting. So I've long said this is the issue of authority is the biggest embarrassment to Roman Catholics. And it's not just a new thing. It's not Francis's fault. I mean, of course, he would seek to abuse these, in my view, abuse these ambiguities. Or it's not JP2's fault, who might seek to abuse the ambiguities to make of the church what he figures is best. But it is a real, bimillennial discontinuity. And this is all I've ever said. Doctrinally, this is our biggest fly in the ointment. It's our biggest hangnail. When you have a bloody cuticle and you just need to clip it off. That's always been a magisterial authority. It's not perfectly clear. And so for the rad trads, not moderate trads, as I mentioned, to say this is clear apostasy, or for whatever the Pope's splainers are going to say, to wag their fingers at any kind of amelioration or hand waving represented by this new study document against kind of monarchicalism, papal monarchicalism, That doesn't make much sense either, because there was a first Christian millennium that happened. Same thing we say to Protestants. You got to deal with that first 1,500 years. Well, papal maximalists do have, you're hearing maybe what you'd identify as a bias in me come out, because I'm a minimalist. But those papal maximalists do have to philosophically treat of the fact that there was a first Christian millennium where the papacy was not this monarchical, regal throne. So I'm going to read from the document in a second, but these are my preliminary thoughts. I'll read also from the Koch interview. I'm not being bawdy here. His name is Cardinal Koch. I'm going to read from the Cardinal Koch interview, and you'll see this is actually, unlike any of this other shit from Francis, which is pure, mundane, interesting in a soap opera way, but mundane, banal, Peronist power games. This is actually philosophically and theologically and ecclesiologically quite interesting, quite relevant to things Jay Dyer's screaming about on a stream. This is not like arguing with a Protestant where it's just like, oh, this is so stupid. Why am I wasting my time? Whenever I debate with a Protestant, I'm like, look, I have a scholar's checkmate. I can prove to you Sola Scriptura is stupid in a 4-move checkmate. And you have entire networks devoted to just talking to Protestants, and they redo the same like 5 talking points every day. I'm talking about Catholic answers. I just don't get why you guys are so interested in that. Protestantism is stupid. It is self-referentially self-contradictory. But Eastern Orthodox, it's just not the same thing. There are many more split ends here, and there are many more semi-reasonable or reasonable points they raise, even I don't even think Jay Dyer agrees with me, even like Bulgakov at Vatican I raises some, I think, interesting points. Eastern Orthodox have some points. The fact that the first Christian millennium is other than, in its conception of papal primacy, the second Christian millennium in such a readily appreciable way, by itself bespeaks the same truth. It's not a waste of your time philosophically to do Eastern Orthodox apologetics. And that's what is at hand here in this new document entitled, let me get the full name for you. I was talking to my friend Ryan this morning about it, and he had helpful comments. The document is entitled The Bishop of Rome. That's simple. Primacy. I thought it was, well, the subtitle is longer. Pope. It's called Pope.
It's just called Pope.
Yeah. The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in the Ecumenical Dialogues and in the Responses to the Encyclical Ut Unum Sint, a study document 2024. Okay, so that's a longer name. But yeah, the main title is The Bishop of Rome. I'm going to go to this section on Vatican I and read for you. But first, I want you to remember that these very, very large scope problems, large scale problems, are beyond your and my reach and grasp. Focus on the small. That's what we're supposed to do. It's the heart of Christianity anyway. Subsidiarity means focus on the local. Focus on the locus. The way to do that is to make sure that you are in the best place possible. Go to www.realestateforlife.org. Yesterday, when I was given at a little snow cone shop, famous snow cone shop near me in Mississippi, it's called Connie Cone. Beautiful, beautiful people, beautiful little shop. They're constantly busy. They give my family of 9 free snow cones anytime Connie's in shop, the owner. And it's like $25 worth of snow cones. We're not talking nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah,
My daughters are like, why? Oh, why? My daughter, Maggie, who's 13, is quite bright. Like, why are people so much nicer here than California? And I was like, well, let me show you. And I got out my phone and I said, Siri, or whatever the stupid like e-thought on the other end is. I was like, Siri, what is the most Christian state in the United States? And then it brought up a bunch of articles saying Mississippi is tied for number 1 with Alabama. Then I said, Siri, or whoever the e-thought is, what is the most conservative state in the United States of America? And it said, hands down, Mississippi. Go to realestateforlife.org and get someplace good. It's not just that it's safer. It's that your quality of life improves so much when people around you, even if they're not all Catholic, they love you for being good, Christian, honest, true, a propensity to procreate. They like your family for being large instead of hating it. It's a much better life.
They give you free snow cones.
You get free snow cones from Connie. They're good snow cones, too. Like 200 flavors.
And we go like every other day.
We go like every other day. And whenever Connie is in shop, it's free. So realestateforlife.org. I mean, don't necessarily all of you come to Mississippi because we kind of want to keep it, you know, America's best kept secret. I guess I'm not doing my part. But go someplace red because you can control where you live, and where you live has a direct bearing. You're not meant to live around people that are different from you, philosophically. Did you know that? You guys have all been brainwashed into condemning classical liberalism. Yeah, there's a lot of wrong. A lot that's wrong in classical liberalism. However, the condemners of classical liberalism, the post-liberals, never tell you that you're not supposed to live in a giant place with factions, with people who are different from you. They'll never condemn pluralism, which is the heart of liberalism. You're supposed to live around people who you agree with about most stuff. That's called subsidiarity. You'll never hear the post-liberals say this because they are on the opposite side. They're trying to brainwash you. So you can't control that. Move to a red state today. Get out of your blue, get to the red. I moved from the bluest of the blue to the reddest of the red. Secondly, in terms of focusing on the small, you see the philosophical coherence of the ideas of this channel? Secondly, you need to be the leader of your home. Men. Your wives need to be your helpmates. They need to be at home, helping you out. A lot of people say, well, how? I didn't start out my marriage this way. Catholicism isn't teaching this anymore. They don't. They'll lie about it. They'll tell you a lie called mutual submission. At the marriage classes, for whatever, 6 months before you get married, they'll straight up tell you a lie, a false gospel, that the man's not the leader. Okay, so how do you reconnoiter enemy from friend here? Well, go to timothyjgordon.com and click classes and look at this offering that you can sign up for today. $175 for a class for you and your spouse to learn how to be a Christian married couple. It's called the One Flesh Work Class, how Christian marriage actually works. There's really one big problem: fighting, or the threat of fighting in marriage, because you have been duped into egalitarianism. Now, I know most of you have been married 10, 15, 20 years, and you've been doing it wrong the whole time. So you need specifics. This is a 9-course class that begins on September the 11th to knock over the twin towers of egalitarianism and feminism. How about that? So we're beginning on September the 11th to knock over the twin towers of egalitarianism and feminism. Sign up today. Sign up today for that class. You're focusing on what you can actually focus on. And then to teach you and your family, your kids should be in homeschool. We have a whole bunch of materials. The other classes, they're all $100 less. They're all $75. We have like 15 course offerings. Even if you have no clue how to begin homeschooling, make this summer the inflection point about which you decide, I am not sending my kids to those Luciferian schools anymore. By that, I mean Catholic schools or public school. It's all nonsense. And if you don't know much how to teach homeschool, don't we still have a 4-class course on how to begin homeschool?
Yeah, we talk about the materials you need. We lay out exactly per grade, like what you teach, what books to buy, all that stuff. That's on timothyjgordon.com. Click classes and everything is listed there.
So that's like the meta magisterium. We teach the teachers, this is what you need. It's very little. Even homeschool the curricula is a contradiction in terms. John Dewey, communist at the University of Chicago in early 20th century, made up curricula. That's not how classical education works. It's called grammar school because you teach your kids sentence diagramming. What else? Sentence diagramming. Make them whizzes at grammar. That's why it's called grammar school, K through 5th. Well, doesn't it take 8 hours a day? No, that's the communists said we have to get kids out of the home for 8 hours a day so that we can get dames working. It was all happening at the University of Chicago, and you've just been brainwashed. You need an hour to 2 of grammar a day between 1st grade and 5th grade. And the communists, like John Dewey, made up kindergarten to get kids that way a year earlier. So then in what we call middle school and high school, you're moving through logic and rhetoric, and I show you how to do that. And the day will be slightly longer there. But so that's a class we give away. And maybe is that $75 or free? Then yeah, that might still be free. But then all the other classes are particular classes. I think everything's $75. Everything must go. So adults, kids, there's not a lot of difference in who needs to be taking these courses. You haven't been taught the stuff we're teaching. There's so many courses we have that are just not taught in schools, whether it's Aristotle's Ethics or true church history or true U.S. Constitution. What does it really say? What doesn't it say? J.R.R. Tolkien class, Latin 1, Latin 2. There's so many. I can't even go through all of them. And none of it's stuff that adults or tweens or teens or kids have been taught because you're brainwashed. So go to timothyjgordon.com. So you're tending to your kids. They need to be out of schools. You're tending to your spouse if you go and you take this new course that's going to begin on September 11th. Register today. And you get yourself to a red state that's truly Christian, then it's not going to matter so much what happens at the national level with our politics or a stupid election this year. And it's not even going to matter so much what new wackiness Francis is working on or reunification with Eastern Orthodox. It'll matter a lot less. This is not the Benedict option. This is the Gordon option. These 3 things. Get to a red state. Make sure you are the head of your household. 98% of trad men aren't. 99% of Novus Ordo men aren't. And make sure your kids are being homeschooled. And we have 4 pillars of this channel, but those are kind of the 3 pillars of the Gordon option. You won't care as much about this big far away stuff because it won't matter because you have your own home in order, and most trad Catholics don't. Before I go into the Bishop of Rome doc, let me read some key moments in the Koch doc. In the Cardinal Koch interview. Sorry. That's rough.
Oh dear.
I mean, you can't blame him with a name like that. All right. Let me start here. So Vatican News asks Cardinal Koch, in the 2 millennium of church history, how has the manner of exercising primacy changed? That's a real question. That's not just Francis skullduggery. And what development could there be to make this exercise acceptable also to other churches that are not in full communion with Rome today? Well, that sounds fruity and fake and jehey, like something we're kind of used to. How can we be more palatable to our separated brethren or our schismatized brethren, Protestants and Orthodox? But it's a real question, particularly the first one. How is the manner of exercising the papacy, the primacy, changed in 2 millennia? Well, it's changed quite dramatically. Listen to his answer. I'm not saying it's a great answer. I'm not saying he's not up to some mischief. He's a Franciscan. He's a Francis lieutenant. But facially, his answers are not wrong. He says, certainly, the manner of exercising the Petrine ministry has evolved over time, depending on historical circumstances and new challenges. However, for many theological dialogues, the principles and models of communion honored in the first millennium remain paradigmatic for a future restoration of full communion. I couldn't deny this if I tried. Orthodox honest ones, would be amenable to reunification, which is kind of always the goal, as jihad as that is to focus on much. If we went back to the first millennium's approach to primacy, he goes on, certain criteria of the first millennium have been identified as reference points and sources of inspiration for the exercise of a universally recognized ministry of unity. So he's saying that Orthodox people of goodwill, and a lot of them have goodwill, would recognize papal primacy if it went back to that King Arthur's court, first among equals, primatial primacy instead of kind of monarchical primacy. Okay, whatever that, I mean, I'm not saying you have to love that. I'm not endorsing it per se, but I am saying this is different from other Vatican breaking news shows we do where there's just nothing serious about what Francis or his lieutenants are saying. There's something serious here. Something I am always talking about. Vatican III will be the sum of Vatican I problems plus Vatican II problems. That can't be denied. That's my long-held view. If you watch this show, if you watch all these shows, you will recognize that. Although the first millennium is decisive, he says, many dialogues recognize that it should not be idealized nor simply recreated, because the developments of the second millennium cannot be ignored, and also because a primacy at the universal level should respond to contemporary challenges. So in this case, you have the interesting situation where the papal maximalists, who tend to be Francis people, are actually wanting to go back, they're more trad. They want to go back to the first millennium and kind of ignore the aggrandizement of papal purview in the second millennium. Normally, it's the other way around. The Francis people want to ignore the first millennium and move to the second millennium. In any case, Koch says, a renewed exercise of primacy must ultimately be modeled on service, on diaconia. Authority and service are closely related. Then Vatican News asks him, is it possible to envision for the future a shared form of exercise of the Petrine primacy over all of Christendom, a shared form of exercise of the Petrine primacy over all of Christendom that is separate from the Pope's jurisdiction over the Latin Church? Listen to Koch here. He says, indeed, some ecumenical dialogues suggest a clearer distinction between the different responsibilities of the Bishop of Rome, in particular between what might be called the Pope's patriarchal ministry within the Western Latin Church and his primatial service of unity. Primatial service of unity in the communion of all the churches, both Western and Eastern. When you hear primatial, it's the adjectival of primate. This means, think tetrarchy, think, yes, there's the head of See of Rome, head of See of Constantinople, head of See of Jerusalem, head of See of Antioch, head of See of Alexandria, and they're ranked, but their ranking did not imply for 1,000 years or so a universal jurisdiction where the Rome primate can tell the Constantinople primate, hey, have your bishops and priests shave their hair into the tonsure. Now, it's interesting because I've quoted the fourth pope ever in the 100s doing something like a kind of universal jurisdiction. And I've cited this against Orthodox. I'm not seeking to pretend that doesn't exist, but it's not as forceful. It's insinuative. It's not as forceful as like, hey, you have to do this now. You know why. I'm the primate of Rome. It's insinuative of maybe there should be extreme deference of all the other sees, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, to Rome. But maybe it's not an ipso facto power. Maybe it's more like a heightened degree of influence suggested by the Tetrarchy. But nevertheless, there's something complex going on here. Koch goes on. Moreover, They emphasize the need to distinguish the patriarchal and primatial role of the Bishop of Rome from his function as head of state. The emphasis on the exercise of the Pope's ministry in his particular church, the Diocese of Rome, which Pope Francis has particularly emphasized, calling him just the Bishop of Rome, helps to highlight his episcopal ministry, which he shares with his brother bishops. So then Vatican News asks him, this document is published while the Catholic Church is going through a synodal journey centered precisely on the theme of synodality. What connection is there between synodality and primacy? This is where it starts getting wacky, and I feel like, oh yeah, I just woke up from a slumber with nice dreams about actually semi-important or important issues getting addressed in the church, authority. And then I wake up to a kind of absurd Franciscan reality where we're using stupid terms like synodality again. Here's Koch's answer. It's not all dumb, but it's at least somewhat dumb. The greater part of the responses and dialogue documents clearly agree on the mutual interdependence of primacy and synodality at every level of the church, local, regional, and even at the universal level. Consequently, primacy must be exercised in a synodal manner, and synodality requires primacy. So he's saying there's a mutual constitutive rapport born between synodality and primacy. And again, this, in a semi-sensible way, insinuates that the Pope is the first among equals, this first millennium notion, the Pope is the first among equals, but that the equals' voices matter some because they're kind of equals. I mean, these are Orthodox terms. This isn't the way that any Catholic would term it, but I'm just saying, okay, these are sort of the terms of the debate. These are the terms of engagement. He says, on all these aspects, our dicastery has also organized conferences entitled Listening to the East and Listening to the West. It's nice that they listen to us some too. Listening to the different Christian traditions regarding synodality and primacy as a contribution to the synodal process. Now, listen to this question, follow-up by Vatican News. A decisive step regarding primacy was the dogmatization of the infallibility of the Bishop of Rome when speaking ex cathedra and his jurisdictional power over the Church. Can you tell us whether and how a new reading and understanding of Vatican Council I is possible in light of Vatican II and the steps taken on the ecumenical path? They make it seem like Vatican II knocked loose some of the strictures of universal jurisdiction level primacy. But really, I always just think Lumen Gentium 25, which seems to tighten the noose of primacy, where it says, you know, you have to, as a Christian, you have to exercise a religious submission of mind and of will and intellect anytime a pope even speaks, even if it's not ex cathedra. So I might be approaching the meaning, the call of the question differently than Koch, but here's what he says. Certainly, some dialogues have endeavored to interpret the First Vatican Council in the light of its historical context, objective, and reception, since its dogmatic definitions were profoundly conditioned by historical circumstances. They suggest that the Catholic Church seek new expressions and vocabulary faithful to the original intention, integrating them into an ecclesiology of communion and adapting them to the current cultural and ecumenical context. There is therefore a talk of re-reception or even reformulation of the teachings of Vatican I. Now that sounds big, and rad trads, as opposed to moderate trads like myself, are probably shitting Nokias all across the nation. Actually, they are. We've already seen this from early this morning. They're pooping out Nokias. And they're pretending they're alarmed, but they're not. They're not. They're excited because these are sedes who want to see problems everywhere. It's a hypochondriac confusion that they're actually excited about. Imagine like a hypochondriac who's actually excited when he thinks he's envisioning a worst case scenario. That's what a sede is. They want to say we're wrong. They're far more intellectually dishonest in some ways than even like what I would say Eastern Orthodox. I think Eastern Orthodox have some legitimate gripes here. So do sedes in some sense. and I've said where I think so, but I think they're being dishonest when they're like, oh, there it is. Cardinal Koch just said there's talk of reformulation of the teachings of Vatican I. Aha, we have it. Eureka, we were right all along. Last Pope, Pius XII, 1958. Everything else was fake and gay. Not necessarily. Let me jump, since he's talking about Vatican I, to page 41 in this document. What's it called? The Bishop of Rome, with the longest subtitle ever. Page 41 of the document. There's a lot of fluff. The fluidity of all of these Francis Vatican documents are not to be overstated. It's not possible to overstate. This is 2.3.1, a hermeneutical approach to Vatican I, page 41. The historical context of the council. Just allow me to read. I don't do too much just reading from documents, but it's important in this case. Vatican I should be understood within the framework of its historical context. So some manner of historical critical. The Farfa Sabina group, the Gruppe des Domes, the St. Irenaeus group, and the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue four different groups have all reflected on the fact that in the 19th century, time of Vatican I, the Catholic Church was responding to various challenges. Ecclesiologically, Gallicanism revived the concept of conciliarism by placing an emphasis on the autonomy of national churches. My friend Ryan was reminding me this morning that such conciliarism, which goes hand in hand with Gallicanism, can't just be hand-waved away the way a lot of trads or maximalists will hand-wave it away. There is a document a conciliar document, that actually seems to enshrine conciliarism. Things are not as clear when we look at all the ecumenical councils as we like to say. I'm not saying this means apostasy. I'm saying it means something about the meta-magisterium that hasn't been clearly articulated yet. Yeah, later Gallicanism ends up getting, hand-waved away. But conciliarism is something real that has been damn near, if not outright, vindicated at councils. And even think of the fact that councils, when they make dogmatic claims, yeah, they're signed by the Pope, but they themselves they exist alongside teaching by the Pope. There's tension here, because even we admit now, it's like, well, yeah, that's an ecumenical council. My point is to say that far be it from us to say, oh, conciliarism's so silly. It's been propped up at various times by various councils, which is sort of like M.C. Escher's hand drawing itself. But we even live with the philosophical residue of this fact today. We'll say, oh, that was in a conciliar constitution. So what's going on? Is it the Pope? Or is it Congress that really holds the power? Well, it's both. Okay. It's not that clean. You don't know and I don't know. I don't say that when I know, but you don't know and I don't know. So we have to deal with that. So ecclesiologically, Gallicanism had revived the concept of conciliarism by placing an emphasis on the autonomy of national churches. It's a historical fact. And then it gets sort of condemned and hand-waved away later. Politically, the church was challenged by regalism, an increased state control of the church, and the growing influence of an anti-clerical liberalism. Intellectually, rationalism and modern scientific developments raised questions about the traditional formulations of the faith. In reaction to these challenges, and as a counter to them, the Ultramontane movement, the Ultramontanists, promoted the leadership of the Pope and the creation of a more centralized church modeled on contemporary political regimes of sovereignty. This is a fact. I'm not a big historical critical guy. I mean, have you ever heard me say stuff that's consonant with historical critical method? But this is all but impossible to deny. Vatican I was absolutely conditioned. And there's another fact too, how it began. These 3 or 4 conditions gravely shaped how it began. How about how it ended? In this context, the majority of bishops saw in a reinforced papacy a protection for the freedom of the church and more generally a force for unity in the face of the modern world. Well, there's this, okay, so that's more how the forces that shaped Vatican I at its beginning, but how about how it ended? That was the last sentence of that paragraph. Here's how it ended. A further complicating factor, this is paragraph 61, a further complicating factor is the interruption of the council as a result of the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which contributed to an imbalance in its ecclesiology. How many times have you heard me say that? I didn't make the first point much here on Rules for Retrogrades, but I've made this latter point about like it was brought to a close abruptly. It wasn't even closed until like right before Vatican II. Was it Pius XII who closed Vatican I? Like 100 years later, 90 years later? Or was it John the 23rd? I can't remember. It wasn't even closed ever. It was like a temporary closing because the Franco-Prussian War broke out. And the conditions for the breakout of the Franco-Prussian War and the attack on even secular sovereignty in Europe and the attack by rationalism on traditional Christianity, Christian belief of all stripe, gave incentive to the Vatican I fathers to really, really bulwark the papacy in a way it had never been bulwarked before, and that seems to have happened. And then the fact that it closed so suddenly means that we have a truncated understanding of the documents because the documents themselves were truncated in their draftsmanship. The council was not able to go beyond an initial ecclesiological document on the papacy. That's true. That's just a fact. You look like there are all these Vatican II documents and they're all florid and lengthy and a pain in the neck to read and saying more than they need to. Vatican I's the opposite. You have basically 2 documents. Pastor Eternus, and I always forget the other one's name. And they don't say that much. We talk about Pastor Eternus like it says a ton, but pretty much it's ex cathedra, infallible, a few other insinuative things, and then it's done. The council was not able to go beyond an initial ecclesiological document on the papacy and did not therefore treat the mystery of the church as a whole. The issue of the bishops in the church, their tasks and rights, was not debated in detail and formulated as ecclesial doctrine until Vatican II. Fact. That's a fact. This document I'm reading from here, Bishop of Rome, is not a bunch of Franciscan fluff, Jesuitical casuistry. I know they're saying stuff that's at least partly true because it is, and because I state a lot of these things on broader shows on our magisterium and ecclesiology. For this reason, the Farfa Sabina group states, quote, the hermeneutical rule that the results of Vatican I must be read in the light of the statements of Vatican II is in line with these historical facts. In this way, the content of what was accomplished in 1870 is preserved while at the same time seen in a more complex context. Now, in the next section, it gets complex. I teach textualism in the constitutional course that I run because I am a product of the great Mike Rappaport, who was my mentor in law school. I took almost all constitutional construction courses. Justice Scalia, the great master on textualism, understood that there are these 2 strains of so-called originalism. There's textualism, which is the correct originalism. When you read any group text, ratified constitutional text, there's textualism, that's correct originalism. And then there's incorrect originalism, which is intentionalism. Stanley Fish, the philosopher of language, is the great advocate of intentionalism. Textualism means you read a text for its original public meaning. You use the mean because you had a small cadre of draftsmen, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a large demos of ratifiers. And you don't have our res, our La Cosa Nostra, our document, until the ratifiers become the secondary authors by undersigning it. So to produce a group constitutional document with the kind of primary authors, the ones, minority group that actually wrote it, and then the secondary authors who said, okay, we reached some quorum, some minimum number of ratifiers who said, yes, this document's actually a thing, without which you don't actually have La Cosa Nostra, you don't have a res or a document. In order to have that, we have to judge the words of the primary authors by the same strictures that the secondary authors, the ratifiers, who are really the ones who are holding the decision as to whether or not to make this document into a document or a failed thing, we have to judge by the same strictures that those people did. What did that mean? Original public meaning. That's textualism, meaning the original conception of all the definitions of all the terms used and the public conception of all those terms used, meaning in like Vatican II context, whether you had all these crazy Jesuits meeting at my school, I own it. No, I went there, the Greg, at night, holding the shadow council and saying, let's use this term according to this Wittgensteinian private meaning. We'll get them to ratify it because the public meaning is more innocuous, but our little private meaning will, after they ratify it, will tip the scales in subcommittees, which ran from 1965 when Vatican II Council ended till 1970, will tip the scales from the public meaning, which was ratified, toward the private meaning of certain terms, which was not ratified. That doesn't count. What I'm always saying about Vatican II is it's only the original public meaning that was ratified. What is the locus of meaning? Where is the meaning actually located? The original public quiddities of those terms. So like if they thought quigibo meant black, all the ratifiers at Vatican II or at Vatican I or at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, if they thought the word quigibo means black and they say, I'm going to undersign that because quigibo meant black in 1789 or 1870, Vatican I, Pastor Aeternus, or 1960, whatever, depending on which Vatican II document, 1963, if we're talking about, the liturgical document. What the hell? What's the liturgical document from Vatican II? I can't believe I've forgotten it. It was the first one ratified. Someone in the chat spit it at me. If quigibo means black and all the ratifiers meant black, but all of the secret cadre of leftists, the small cadre of leftists, who are like, by quigibo, we mean white, even though the public meaning is black. And then later it gets ratified, quigibo, the term, and they say, yeah, we accept this. We go back, we say, what's the original public meaning of quigibo in 1963? Sacrosanctum concilium. No one spit that at me. That's just my memory actually sort of working like a young man's for a moment. Then what counts? What do we go forward? Was the blackness of quigibo ratified or the whiteness? Well, the original public meaning. So that's Scalianism. And that's proper originalism. For this next section of the document, not intentionalism. The Stanley Fish philosophy. Intentionalism is like, what's the intention of the actual authors? This is not something we ask, because the authors could be these private subversives who are meeting using vague language like they did at Vatican II. They're meeting by nightfall at the Gregorian University in those years, 1962, 63, 64. This is a fact. This is a well-known fact. And they're like, let's use private meanings and public meaning. All it comes down to is the locus of meaning that which is ratified publicly the public meaning of a term that all the hundreds, thousands of ratifiers that Vatican II ratified? Or is it the private Wittgensteinian meaning that, like a handful, a couple dozen subversives, Lavender Mafia subversives, Ronerites, are meeting to secretly Trojan horse in? It's clearly, because we have to have this voting process, it's clearly the public meaning that gets ratified. So even if you ratify the public meaning, backdoor in the private meaning, it's correct and always correct to go through and say, the intent of the draftsman is not correct. It's the intent of the ratifiers, which is really correct. And the intent of the ratifiers is knowable by going and saying, what was the meaning of this term, the original public meaning of this term, that term, the other term, the day and the year they ratified it. That's textualism. To try to assess the intent of the private meaning, Trojan horsed in by the lying draftsmen, the Ronerites at Vatican II, that's wrong. That's Stanley Fish intentionalism. And there seems to be some misunderstanding on this score. Most people haven't studied this that closely. So listen to this section in the next paragraph, 62, in the Bishop of Rome. Distinction between intention and expression. When they're saying intention, they really mean original public meaning. They don't mean Stanley Fish intentionalism. They just, non-Americans haven't studied jurisprudence and constructive texture and intent as much as, well, me and other people that are devotees of the late, great Scalia, or even more on point, Mike Rappaport, my legal mentor, who ran the Originalist Society and was great friends with Scalia, runs the Originalist Society. Another important hermeneutical principle, and when they say hermeneutical, this is the Catholic term for constitutional construction, interpretation. Another important hermeneutical principle is to interpret the First Vatican Council in the light of its intentions. Wrong, you should say, in the light of its original public meaning. Sorry, I'll get annoying. I'll keep repeating that. As the St. Irenaeus group states, a hermeneutics of dogma draws attention to the fact that one must distinguish between the formula of a dogma, what is said, and the statement intended, what is meant. The council wished its decisions to be understood according to the ancient and constant belief of the universal church. So they mean original public meaning. They don't mean intent. That's a bad loaded term. They're just using it wrong. Pastor Eternus' introduction states as much. As it is contained in the proceedings of the ecumenical councils and in the sacred canons, especially those, quote, in which the Western and Eastern churches were united in faith and love. And I think they mean in the first millennium, obviously, prior to 1054 AD. The Farfa Sabina group calls, therefore, for a distinction between the enunciabile, conditioned by a specific context and language, and the rest of the dogmatic definitions of Vatican I. Now, they do far better to use discourse of American originalism, where you have good originalism, textualism, original public meaning is what's reified, versus Stanley Fish intentionalism, where you reify the private intention of the primary authors, not the ratifiers. Well, then why have ratifiers at all? What you always ask of the intentionalists is, why have ratifiers at all? If 5,000 or whatever it is, 3,000 Vatican II fathers had to ratify Sacrosanctum Concilium or the other three constitutions, well, then their ratification is a sine qua non of the document becoming a thing, a res. If you're one vote shy of ratification, as the initial attempts at many constitutions are, then you have nothing at all. You just have a draft. You toss it in the fire. Do you see what I'm saying? So if the intentionalists are right, then why take a vote? If the intentionalists are right and all the true meaning of the text is what the 15 drafters of Sacrosanctum Concilium meant, I mean, we know who the main we know who the main drafter of Sacrosanctum was, right? Annibale Bonini, Freemason Annibale Bonini. But there are other guys that helped him to wedge this thing in. If the intentionalists are correct and the draftsman's intent is all that matters in circumlocating the actual meaning of Sacrosanctum Concilium, well, then why did we put it to a vote of like 3,000 to 5,000? I forget how many voters there were at Vatican II. Why put it to a vote at all? No, the fact that we put constitutional language to a vote at all, and that vote is determinative for whether or not we have a thing, a res, a document, that very fact proves textualism correct. Because the private misgivings and the private meanings, fake meanings, deceptive meanings of draftsmen notwithstanding, whatever, I'm asking you to be a little Platonic now for once. I'm usually asking you to be Aristotelian. Think of the quiddity, the real essence of the terms being designated by the authors, the real ones, the original and public ones in the minds of the ratifiers. You say quijibo and you mean black, and everyone thinks you mean black? Okay, you have 4,000 ratifiers saying, yes, we want quijibo to mean black. That's what it means in 1963. But if these little Ronerite, this cadre of subversives, band of robbers, is like, but we're going to actually make it mean white in the coming years, in people's minds. That's not what they were attempting to ratify. So that's not intentionalism. That's what we call textualism. And so it's unfortunate that these Europeans who wrote this document just have such a paltry understanding of the actual terms. So they're saying intentionalism, and they must de facto mean textualism. I hope I've explained it adequately. They call for a distinction between the enunciabile and the res. The definition itself and what it defines is the enunciabile, but the act of faith is addressed not to it, but to what is intended by it, its meaning, at the res that is intended by it. If such a distinction is drawn, then the meaning of the infallibility of dogma and the primacy of jurisdiction could be objectively established as followed. 1. Helping to ensure the unity of the church in fundamental questions of Christian faith in cases where it is threatened. 2. Ensuring the freedom of the proclamation of the gospel and the free nomination to the ecclesial offices in all social systems. Go to paragraph 63 next. On the basis of this distinction, the Farfa Sabina group was able to conclude, quote, the results of newer historical investigations allow one now, in fact, to distinguish the actually intended meaning of Vatican I from the way it was expressed under the circumstances prevailing at the time. It was this garb, however, this way of formulating the doctrine that favored the prevailing maximalist interpretation of both dogmas in the past. I don't find that such a stretch. I don't. That council had no intention of either denying or rejecting the tradition of the first millennium, to wit, the church as network of mutually communicating churches. Although it may certainly be premature to state that the divergences concerning the papal ministry have been overcome, the new view of Vatican I allows Lutherans and others to arrive at a new assessment of the conciliar definitions. I don't know what Lutherans have to do with it. I thought we were talking about I'm going to have to go back and even think why they... What they're saying, though, is that it's intentionalist in some sense and textualist in another. I'm not going to be able to articulate here. It's an imperfect understanding of constitutional construction, and I think it's bad. So I do disagree with what they're saying in this document, but I don't disagree with the principle that Pastor Aeternus does not have to be considered, the way it's currently interpreted, the only construction of papal power, the only configuration of papal power that's right. If it were, then the first Christian millennium would be Heil. Would be Heil. And we never would have been united with the Eastern Orthodox. Never. For 1,000 years, for 1,053 years, we were united with them. There would be no explanation of what happened. Paragraph 64, there's a distinction between the text and its interpretation. In addition, the subsequent interpretation of the resolutions by the Catholic Church's magisterium is of the greatest significance for an adequate understanding of the Church's teaching. Indeed, historical investigation leads one to observe that many of the ways in which Vatican I was received, especially maximalist ones, were not faithful to the definitions of the Council. Only if one is conscious of these differences between the original intention, I would say original text, and the ensuing reception, is it possible to overcome the subsequent apologetic attitudes. That's the St. Irenaeus group. As a preliminary show, I want to conclude here. I've read you the parts that I think are semi-reasonable to reasonable and really do allow for a kind of study commission. Unlike communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, what's a study commission going to do? The answer is no. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Jesus says it. You can't remarry if you divorce your wife. Jesus says it's adultery in 2 of the 4 Gospels. Sorry. And therefore, it's a mortal sin. You can't go get communion. Oh, but my grandpa, my dad, they're such nice men. Okay, tell them to stop pincushion. I won't say it. Tell them to stop having sex with a new person. And then they can go back. If they're really a nice guy, they'll stop. But they've been with their new... Okay, that's clear. Why form a study commission? Because Francis is a sophist. Women can't be deacons. JP2 even made this dogmatic, whatever that means, in the late 90s. Why have a study commission before, during, and after the Amazon Synod and the Synod on Synodality? Because Francis is a casuist. You can't use artificial contraception. This has been made clear several times, dogmatically, over the course of 20 Christian centuries, and in the 20th Christian century, right? Pius XI's encyclical is considered definitive on that. Well, not Quadragesimo, I'm forgetting. Homo sapienality, definitive, de fide. Why have a study commission on it? It's wrong. But this is different. For 1,000 Christian years, we had a conception of papal primacy that was de minimis. And for a significant portion of the second Christian millennium, it was growing. And then toward the end, in the late 1800s, for these historical reasons, you have a drastic offshoot, precipitous spike in the definition of papal authority. And that's like 1870. And then I would say, I have to see what they're doing to mitigate it in Vatican II. I always just think Lumen Gentium 25, which I think grows it a little more. So that's not something that's stupid to commission a study commission on, or whatever the verb is. That's not stupid at all. For half or more of those blessed years we count beginning from the year of our Lord, the Lord of the year of Jesus Christ's birth, to have stood for the proposition of a de minimis Bishop of Rome, the de minimis conception of that authority of the Pope, being maximized for clearly, I think, intelligibly, appreciably secular motives. Because what was happening in Europe as the Holy Roman Empire actually died in the 19th century was brought to a close. And then Masons around Europe were destroying all sovereignty secularly. Well, okay, so you get this ultramontane movement that has something to do with Vatican I. And then Vatican I is ended abruptly. And even the main document, Pastor Aeternus, doesn't say much about how do we even know when there's an exercise of ex cathedra papal authority. We Catholic scholars can't even agree how many exercises of ex cathedra infallibility have occurred ever. I mean, this is not clear. This is not something stupid to study commission. I'm a bit surprised to be saying it, but I'm saying it. This is my honest view. This is not the document that I thought would tumble out on Thursday, and I have to still read the full thing. I encourage you to do so faithfully, do so in good spirit. Subscribe to this channel. It's not related thematically. That's free. And a little less than free is support this channel. We want to hit 100,000 subscribers. That's our goal, so subscribe. And support this channel on Locals and Subscribe Star. Tons of new benefits. God bless you all. Let me know in the comments what you think. I'm not always one of these YouTubers. It's like, tell me in the comments. Sometimes it's too straightforward to make a comment. You hear the news and you're like, okay. This is important. I want to hear from you guys in the comments. God bless you all. Deus Volt.
Broken